Greetings. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and on behalf of the China Center here at the University of Minnesota, I'd like to welcome you to the 15th Annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture, China's Disruptors, How Leading Chinese Entrepreneurial Companies Are Changing China and the World, with Dr. Edward Xie. From Apple to Coca-Cola to 3M, U.S. companies have covered the globe, expanding their businesses beyond borders and markets. Dr. Xie looks at the evolution of Chinese businesses and their quest to become global. They are changing business practices in China and abroad. I'm excited to hear Dr. Xie share his thoughts about these entrepreneurs and their impact. But first, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Bob and Kim Griffin for their vision and generosity and passion that's inspired this lecture series and built a legacy that we can all share. Thanks to them, throughout the last 14 years, we've learned from scholars, dialogued with diplomats, wrestled with tigers, and witnessed the ever-changing and nuanced U.S.-China relationship through the lens of experts with diverse disciplines and experiences with China. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for your support for this lecture and for the China Center and the university's historic engagement in China. It is indeed a great pleasure to explore the many issues, challenges, and wonders of China with you. You'll find cards on your seats to submit your questions during the Q&A session. And I hope that you'll please stay at the end of the lecture for a book signing, which will be at the rear of the hall here. Now, please join me in welcoming the Associate Vice President and Dean Meredith McQuaid to the stage. Dean McQuaid oversees the university's Global Programs and Strategy Alliance. She works with the university's senior leadership to chart the university's global strategy and enrich the dimensions of teaching, research, and engagement across our campuses and colleges. Please welcome Dean McQuaid.
Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of the University of Minnesota, I am delighted to be here to join Joan and all of our staff at the China Center, thanking you for coming this evening to attend the 15th Annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. For the past decade and a half, Griffin Lectures have explored a variety of social, economic, and political topics. And while the scope has been broad, the purpose is precise: to promote understanding and mutual respect between the people of the United States and China. Of course, in this crazy election season, maybe the craziest we've ever seen, we are all witness to the hyperbolic statements of why we should and why we should not foster stronger ties with China, its people, and its government. But for all of us here in this place, connected as we are with Chinese family, friends, colleagues, and partners, we are not only intimately aware of the importance of creating and maintaining strong ties, but we are also, many of us, aware of just how harmful mutual misunderstanding and distrust can be in both cultures. Those of us who are privileged to work at the University of Minnesota have seen and continue to see the genuine benefits of a long and strong connection with China. We see the positive impact the connection with China has had in many aspects of daily life on and off campus. Being culturally aware and socially astute is important, of course, whether you're doing business with China, working with the university's nearly 3,000 Chinese students and scholars, or simply looking to expand your perspective and understand world news. As the connections between the United States and China continue to expand, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you in the audience and those throughout the university community and greater Twin Cities who are committed to strengthening these bonds. I'm looking forward to our lecture this evening and to the evolution of the Bob and Kim Griffin Lecture Series. Each of the lectures has been unique, but collectively, they represent the depth and breadth of the dynamic relationship between a terrific university and a wonderful country. I would like to now introduce Mr. Ed Dieter, who will then introduce our 2016 Griffin Lecture. Mr. Dieter is the Deputy Director of the Minnesota Trade Office and a member of the China Center Advisory Council. The Minnesota Trade Office, as most of you know, is a division of the Department of Employment and Economic Development and the state's official export promotion arm. Having joined the MTO in 2008, Ed Dieter's current role as Deputy Director is to develop curriculum for and conduct export and international business education seminars, provide international consulting services, and direct the Trade Assistance Team to help Minnesota companies export products and services overseas. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ed Dieter.
Thank you, Meredith. And thank you to Bob and Kim Griffin for sponsoring this annual Building U.S.-China Bridges lecture, now in its 15th year. As I have attended over the last several years, these lectures have led to insightful discussions with speakers who've had a wide array of experience in China. This series was established to promote and build understanding between American and Chinese cultures, to connect and build appreciation between people, and to provide opportunities for people living on opposite sides of the globe to understand the many things that we have in common. And at the Minnesota Trade Office, we know that China has been either our number 2 or number 3 export market for over 10 years now. So the interaction between our state and China has a long academic history here at the university, but also a long and very fruitful business aspect. These principles upon which the Griffin Lecture was founded are principles that are essential for the continued relationship between the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, and China. And I personally am very excited to hear from Dr. Xi this afternoon, and I'm sure that he will provide us with a perspective from inside of China that we don't get many opportunities to hear. Dr. Edward Xi is founder and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company, a global strategy and management consulting firm with roots in China. He formerly led the China business of the Boston Consulting Group and Booz Allen Hamilton Booz & Company for a period of 20 years. Widely called China's leading global strategy consultant, he was a leader of the team who set up and led China's first government-authorized office among all international strategy consulting firms in the early 1990s. Dr. Xi specializes in the definition and implementation of business strategy, organizational effectiveness, and corporate transformation across various industries, as well as cross-cultural partnerships and mergers and acquisitions. He has assisted hundreds of companies, headquartered both within and outside China, on all aspects of business related to China and its integration to the rest of the world. He also consults to public sector organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Chinese government on issues related to policies, state-owned enterprise reform, and competitiveness. He continues as an external board member for several large Chinese national companies, is a special advisor of the Shanghai Municipal Government, and a member for the Hong Kong Special Administration Region Government's Commission for Strategic Development. He's author of over 200 articles and 4 books, including the award-winning The China Strategy and the newly released China's Disruptors. And he is regularly to be found in the pages of Forbes magazine and the Financial Times. He holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an MBA and PhD in civil engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. And so I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this 15th annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. Please welcome Dr. Edward Xi.
Thank you, Ed. It's my big honor to be here this afternoon and to talk to you about a topic that has become quite a topic that I've been following for over 10, 15 years. But this become a center of what I talk about in the last couple of years with a lot of audiences, a lot of my clients actually. And I call this the China disruptors phenomenon. And today, if you could, on the slide is how the Chinese entrepreneurial companies are changing China and the rest of the world. This is an important topic because for a long time, as you know, the perception for many people around the world about China was that China was a one-party state, is by definition authoritarian, and that's true. It's very true. It's still today. And that the Chinese economy is predominantly dominated by the state-owned enterprises. We call it the state economy. And that's also true. The state-owned enterprises are typically large. They are dominant in many sectors, and in fact, in many sectors, they have privileged access that the non-state companies could not get into. And many of the SOEs are supported by the government. So for a long time, the Western media in particular have called China a state capitalism, which means it's no longer communism, it's becoming capitalist, but yet the state or the government has a major role in directing how the capitalism ought to work, which I think many of you would appreciate. It has a somewhat of a negative connotation to it. That it's not pure capitalism, and yet at the same time, the government still continues to play a role. All this is true. It is actually very true. But as I was working in China and Ed was introducing, I was previously, the head of the Boston Consulting Group in China, and that was in the early 1990s. And we were the first international strategy consulting firm which was officially approved by the Chinese government to start an operation in China, in Shanghai. And I was very privileged to become the first managing partner from BCG to run the operations. And of course, in the early 90s, nobody knew what management consulting was all about. I'm talking about China. I think today that is still quite true. A lot of people still don't know what we do. How can people who make money without doing anything, right? It's still quite true today, including that in America, by the way, not only a China phenomenon. But in the early 90s, actually, I think many of you may or may not know that at that time in China, there was not a notion about what a company was. Actually, there's no such a thing as a company because there was no company law in China until 1992. And that's when we first started, we were doing consulting on behalf of BCG. Everything was enterprises. Enterprise, a state-owned enterprise. What is a state-owned enterprise? A state-owned enterprise is an organization which basically take care of everybody within the enterprise from cradle to grave. If you have a child, it has a child center. If you're sick, there's a hospital. If you need to eat something, there's a canteen. That kind of stuff, right? And that was an enterprise. There's no law governing that. And therefore, what is consulting? What is management consulting? Nobody could understand why do you need management. In fact, there's no notion of management in an enterprise or SOEs at that time. But of course, things change a lot. Since the last 20 years, things have changed a lot in China. But by about 15 years ago, in the mid-90s, when I was doing consulting in China, I began to recognize that something is going on in China which is very different. So different than what the Westerners or Western media people has been reporting about China, and I find that how come there's a gap? And that is the budding entrepreneurship in China at that time. Because I was doing a lot of work in consulting. I was giving speeches like this. I was going around different parts of China. And when I did speeches, by definition, the audience was very Chinese. And inevitably, in the end of the presentation, some people will come up to me and say, Dr. Xie, I'm from company XYZ. We have this sort of issues. Can you help? And so on. And a lot of this question, frankly, if I look back to it, they're very rudimentary. But when I reflect upon the interest level of the people, the enthusiasm of the people, and also in some cases the naivety of the people, I began to recognize that something is happening, and that is the beginning of entrepreneurship in China, at least the way that I've experienced it. So I began to monitor this, and some of these companies become my client, many of them did not, and over the time, my portfolio changed. When I first started with BCG, my work was almost 100% multinationals, foreign companies, who were at that time trying to come to the China market, and that's okay. Over time, that mix began to evolve. Multinationals still come to us, but then increasingly we get Chinese clients. 2 years ago, I left these big consulting firms, and I started my own firm, Gaofeng Advisory Company. It's mostly because I believe that China has now become the world's breeding ground or the epicenter for business innovations. Business innovation is coming not only from the Silicon Valleys of the world, but increasingly from China. And that is why it's so important for people who are now at the cutting edge of thought leadership, the cutting edge of trying to drive the best intellectual capital for business and management. People need to be based and rooted in China. Without the roots in China, it's actually very, very difficult to fully appreciate the power of thought leadership and innovation that's coming from China. And that innovation and entrepreneurship are affecting actually not only in China, but also increasingly outside of China in the rest of the world. And that's why I left Booz & Company or Booz & and I became my own entrepreneurs in this process. So that's the background that helped me to decide to write my book, China's Disruptors. And today is almost a synopsis of my book. Obviously, not every slide, every page is exactly what I talk about in my book, but the theme is largely that. It is how the China disruptors, the entrepreneurial companies, how they have come up and how they have begun to change the businesses and also, frankly, the policies in China, but also increasingly in the rest of the world. And let me try to see if I can walk a few of these apparatus on the podium here, which of course, there are a few ones here, so I need to figure out if I do anything wrong, please bear with me. So, for a long time, the world believed that China is predominantly a state-owned enterprise and economy, right? The SOEs are big, they're dominant, and so on. And I began to challenge that. I went back to the data. I went to see the statistics, right? And these are statistics by the Chinese government. And I go back to the late 90s, and I look at both the revenue as well as the profit between the state companies and the non-state companies. As you could tell, the state companies are actually the darker dots, and the non-state companies are the lighter dots. At the end of the 90s, both from the standpoint of both the revenue and from a standpoint of total profit, both state company and non-state company are about the same. Over the last 16, 17 years, divergence have happened. And in fact, today, if you look at the revenue on the left-hand side and the profit on the right-hand side, the non-state companies are already about 3 to 4 times bigger than the state company, which is a big surprise to a lot of people, including many people in China. People thought China is a SOE-dominated economy. Actually, it's not quite true. Of course, some of the biggest companies on a standalone basis are SOEs, like ICBC, the world's biggest bank, right? Like PetroChina, Sinopec, China Mobile. These are by definition huge companies. But when you put everything together, actually, the non-state economy is already bigger than the state economy. And who are these guys, right? Who are the people who are behind this kind of entrepreneurial companies? And, in fact, the entrepreneurs in China have evolved over several different eras. And of course, most of you, know at the end of the 70s, for those who are around my age, you remember that. The younger guys will not, of course. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, we call it Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong died, the Gang of Four was arrested, and that was the end of the Cultural Revolution was really the pit, the bottom of our recent history. We're talking about the last 50, 60, or even 100 somewhat years of history of China. And the people in China were totally disillusioned about the direction, which way should we be going? Because, we thought, the Chinese thought that, Mao Zedong's coming in the 1949, he introduced communism, and we thought, wow, this is great stuff, right? We learned this from the Soviets, and, everybody could be equal, everybody would be happy, everybody would be rich, and so on. And of course, we find out after the first 30 years of the PRC, that's all BS. There's no such thing, right? And Cultural Revolution, the end of it was was really the burst of the bubble, perhaps the biggest bubble in humankind, right? So Deng Xiaoping came to power. He didn't know what to do. He had no clue because our original, theoretical framework was broken. But Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist. He said, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what is going to take us, to get out from this hole. But let's cross the river by filling out those stones, right? Let's take a step at a time. I think you all know that. And so one of the first things that he decided to do was to allow entrepreneurship to come back to China. Because as you know, at 1949, when the PRC was formed, everything was 100% planned economy. What it means is actually that there's nothing private was allowed. In fact, in the first 30 years of the PRC, even if you're a private person, if you just mince the word private, you got caught in the jail. You just minced the word private, right? It was that bad. And Deng Xiaoping took a lot of courage to say, well, let's give it a try. Let's see how it goes. Let's allow private business to come back. So the first generation of the Chinese entrepreneurs who came up were really people who came up in the 80s. And if you could imagine, at that time, there was no businesses. There's no management. There's no MBAs. There's nothing. And people were, but the people who wanted to become entrepreneurs were courageous. They wanted to try something. They may not have the right training. Some of them didn't even go to business, universities. One of my clients is actually Xu Lianjie, who is on the lower right-hand corner. And every time, he's from Fujian provinces. He's running a very successful, business now. But he said, well, every time I talk to him or every time he talks to people, I have not even finished primary school. In fact, he used this as a way to feel good, right? Because, look, I haven't even finished primary school, but look how successful I am today. It's that kind of spirit, the spirit of can do, that I can do despite all the difficulties. And in fact, some of these, the people that I show here, they became the captains of the industries respectively. Some of them are still in business, although they are 60 years old, 70 years old. Many of them are still very active. Like, I'm sure company like Lenovo, Liu Chengzhi, who is the chairman now of Legend, still working. Ren Zhengfei, chairman of Huawei, the world's leading telecom equipment company, he's still working. And then in the early 90s, there's a group of people who were previously working in the Chinese government. They were government people. As you could imagine, in the early 90s, still, the very best and the brightest of the Chinese would want to work for the government, because to be a part of the government, to be a part of the SOEs is glorious, right? But in 1992, something happened. It was when Deng Xiaoping made a visit to Shenzhen and to Shanghai, and he encouraged the people to continue to reform, to continue to open up China, because he feels that by opening up, by continuously to open up China, China have a chance, China had a future. So because of that, quite a number of people who were working in the government decided to leave the government and to engage into businesses, into private business. This is historical, because it really takes a lot of courage for these people to leave the government, because the government offered what we call the iron rice bowl. You know, you work there, you got, you know, you don't worry about losing a job. But these people, some of these people decided to leave because they see the potential upside of private businesses. And again, today, many of them are very successful, like Chen Dongxiang at Taikang Insurance, the chairman for Taikang, largest private insurance company in China. People like Wang Shi, chairman for Vanke, the largest residential property developer in China, very, very successful, and still today. The first wave of the internet companies came around the middle of 1990s, and you got people like Charles Zhang, the lower right-hand corner, chairman of Sohu. Also people like Ding Lei at NetEase and so on. These are the guys who created the clones of someone like an AOL, someone like a Yahoo, etc. Right? But the real guys who are now so influential and make it big in China are the people who were about one step after the first generation, the first wave of the Chinese entrepreneurs. And these are people who today are household names, certainly in China and also increasingly in America. And I'm talking about the likes of Jack Ma at Alibaba, the likes of Pony Ma at Tencent, the likes of Robin Li at Baidu. We call them BATs, B-A-T, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. It's just an acronym for some of the three most successful internet companies. And also by definition, these entrepreneurs has become extremely, extremely successful, both from the standpoint, of course, of the net worth, but also in terms of the inspiration that are now providing to millions of younger people who come later their way. And then perhaps because of the success of BAT, another generation of internet entrepreneurs show up into 2000s. And again, some of these companies by now are very famous, and these are people like Lei Jun at Xiaomi, Richard Liu or Liu Changdong at JD.com, Zhou Hongyi, and so on. But when I was writing my book, and by definition, I went around to do interviews because many of these people are my friends, my clients, and at least acquaintances. But the younger guys, I don't know as well, because they are running startups and so on. So I went around different places. Of course, I went to Beijing. I was in Beijing anyways. I was in Shenzhen anyways. I was in Shanghai anyways. But I also went to some of the so-called lower-tier cities. And I tried to interview the younger guys. And these are younger guys who are the people in China, we call them post-80s, post-90s, people who were born in the 80s and the 90s. And I found a lot of these people around. And a lot of them are running their own entrepreneurial pursuits. The companies may be small, some are bigger, some are smaller, some are early stage, some are a little bit developed already. But I see a lot of them around. And I see a new generation of young people in China who are, number one, looking at people like Jack Ma, Pony Ma, and so on. They look at them as role models. And they will all ask the question, if Jack Ma, Pony Ma, or for that matter, a Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, of course they know of them. If these guys can be successful, why not me? I'm smart. I can be successful as well. I can be as rich or richer than a Jack Ma or Bill Gates. A lot of these young people keep on asking questions. A lot of people say, well, I want to be successful and I don't mind to fail the first time. Because in Chinese, we call it 试错, try, and it's actually try and error in English, right? I don't mind giving it a try. If I lose, if I'm not successful, I can come back again. And at some point, I'll be successful. It is that kind of spirit. It is that kind of momentum, and also this, the waves of the young people that I'm seeing, that I believe that China has gone into a new era. And this era is represented by this, incredible momentum, and incredible intensity and the speed of entrepreneurship, in particular driven by the young people. And this gives me tremendous confidence. So the story about my book, paradoxically, is actually not to talk about Alibaba, although this is on my subtitle. It is added by my publisher to attract people to buy my book. It's a marketing gimmick. The real story that I'm talking about is, as I'm on the right-hand side, and the curve actually means something. It means the exponential increase in the speed and the scale and the intensity. And this is what I'm talking about. It is the large number of people that in China, many of them are in the same ages of your students, of the UM students. They are trying their own different ways. They may be working with a larger company like Alibaba, but they're also trying. They may be having their own little company called ABC or whatever, and they're trying their own ways. It doesn't really matter. The notion that people need to understand is that a lot of them will not be successful, and certainly will not be successful in the first time. But the willingness and the ability to come back over and over again is very high. And the notion that I talk about is that even a small percentage of people who will be successful, a small percentage of a large number is still a large number on a global basis. And that's what we are talking about. So this is what's really happening in China. Everything else that you read in the newspaper is true, but it's only partially true. Because in almost no case that I've seen Western media have really focused on this topic to talk about it. A lot of focus has been on, the crash, the slowdown, the corruption. All these are true, but they're not entirely true. It doesn't really cover, in my view, the most important story that's coming from China, and this is the real China. And so in this process, quite a number of what we call exponential organizations has been formed. What are exponential organizations? These organizations have been growing rapidly within a certain period of time. Of course, in America, you also have a share of exponential organization. Google used to be like that, Airbnb is, Uber is, and so on, and Facebook was, and so on. And that's true. And that is also enabled by the American entrepreneurship, right? In China, we're also seeing quite a number of these people. Depending on how you measure it, someone like a WeChat, I think many of you at least have heard about WeChat, right? And I know that for everyone who is Chinese here, especially the young Chinese, you will be on WeChat, right? Do you agree? Everyone in China is on WeChat. And that's the power, and I'll come back to that. Xiaomi, the smartphone company, Didi Kuaidi, Didi Xuxing, is like the Uber of China, but just a much bigger Uber, that's all. And that's what they're doing in the valuation. It's an incredible story. Of course, no company, including the Facebooks of the world and the Googles of the world, will forever be exponential. But all these companies can demonstrate that within a certain period of time, they can grow much faster. And in many cases, these youngest companies, they can overtake the more traditional, more historical company in the same sector in a very short period of time in terms of valuation. It happens here in America, in Silicon Valley. It also happens a lot in China. A lot of these companies, as you know, by definition, they are focusing on the internet space. And, I think all of you know that internet is really thriving in China, in particular wireless internet. I think all of you know that, the smart devices have really caught on China in a significant way. I think all of you know China is the largest market for the iPhone. But iPhone really is one of the many branded products in China. There are many other choices. But if you look at this, right, so people who are using the internet regularly, around close to 700 million people, about double the size of the American population. A lot, mobile internet or smart devices is extremely prevalent. If you go to China, you see everyone every day, every minute is on the smart device. And someone like WeChat, on the right-hand side, WeChat actually has, this is incredible, right? You know, the active subscriber is larger than the total population of the internet population in China. And you say, how could that be? Because the rest is outside of China. And I do not know, and Facebook included, or Google, email, Google search included. I do not know if there's a single product in the world whose penetration on the addressable market is 100%. WeChat is. Think about this. WeChat market share is over 100%. And then the rest is, of course, you know, the internet is incredible in China, but its penetration is only half of the Chinese population because China have 1.4 billion. A lot of people is on internet, but a lot of people is still not in the internet. You think about the potential upside, that's incredible. And, you know, in a very short period of time, so several years ago, the Chinese had no clue what a unicorn was. And of course, you know, in America, this is a term that is invented by the guys in the Silicon Valley, right? So, and you know, right? So unicorns are a company who are not listed yet. They're still private, but their valuation of at least $1 billion US, right? So, meaning big unlisted company. And of course, you know, in the US has the largest number. There's no question, and almost all of them are from the Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley have had this heritage for the last couple of decades of creating entrepreneurial companies. China is newcomer to this. And about 3-4 years ago, the Chinese had no clue what a unicorn was. They just didn't talk about it, they didn't even know what a unicorn is. But today, China has the world's second largest number of unicorns. And of course, as always, the rate of increase is the fastest in China. China today have over 30-ish unicorns. We're still quite behind the Americas, but compared to the third one, I think the third is Germany, isn't it? Germany, the UK, and so on. The gap is significant. Americans are known to be entrepreneurial, and therefore, it's good. China, from nowhere, the rest of the world. And I could predict almost like everything else that we're seeing, China's going to go this way. America is going to go this way. China's going to go this way. At some point, the two is going to cross over. And that's how the world is working. We call it G2. G2, America and China. This is another manifestation of why that is important. Because this is where the inspirations of the world's business are actually coming from. This is where the ideas are coming from. These unicorns, they don't become unicorns just because people like to throw money at them. Every one of them have a value proposition. Everyone have a clear way of developing future businesses that the investors, the entrepreneurial investors, the venture capitalists, and the angels before them are willing to put a lot of money into this kind of company. So this is what's happening. The other is also quite an interesting trend, is that last year in my alma mater, you know, Technology Review, I think all of you know, a very highly regarded scientific magazine. Last year they came up with a list of 50, what they call 50 smart companies, or smartest companies. And for a long time, of course, you know that, you know, people think of Chinese companies as copycats. People think of them as shanzhai. We call them shanzhai. There's no thought leadership. There's no origination. There's no innovation. It's just a copy, copy, and copy. Yes, it's true, actually. And I wrote a few articles when I was at Booth on this issue about shanzhai innovations, or copying. It's still very much true in China today. But when there's still a big shanzhai phenomenon, increasingly we're seeing companies who are becoming quite original in the thinking. And the MIT guys call them smart companies. And three of the Chinese companies are in the top 10 of the list. And this is not trivial because, again, you know, most of the other companies are American companies, and they're all really innovative and highly respected, like Tesla and so on, right? Like Tesla, Illumina, and those kind of companies. I think SpaceX even somewhere in the middle, right? 15 or something, right? Even SpaceX, great company, right? I don't know how they came up with the list. It doesn't really matter. It's just, I believe that it signifies the beginning of the recognition from some of the leading institutions in the world that the Chinese are no longer just copycats. Some of the Chinese are pretty smart, actually. And I would predict that if Technology Review were to do this slide, this annual survey this year or next year, we're going to see more Chinese representation on this slide. But what is the characteristics of this kind of Chinese companies that we talk about? Why are they different? Why could they become exponential? And there are a number of characteristics to them that I think is quite unique. Number one is, as I mentioned, these entrepreneurs are very eager to ask the question, why not me? If someone else is successful, why not me? You know, if a Jack Ma is successful, if a Pony Ma is successful, and for some others, you know, if a Bill Gates or Zuckerberg or Li Ka-shing can be successful, why not me? I'm also smart. You know, Jack Ma didn't even go to university, right? And he can be so successful. And I'm a university graduate. I went to Jiao Tong University. I went to Tsinghua University. Why not me? I'm smarter. Second, a lot of these companies are fearless experimentation people. You know, they use the market to experiment. They're fearlessly willing to experiment. And of course, many of them are engaging in business model innovation. They're not building the latest rockets into the space. They're not Elon Musk. But at the same time, you know, they build some of the cutting edge business model, and business model allows people to try and to learn. And a lot of them are very good at applying the 80-20 rule. I'm 80% right, and I think there's demand in the market. Let me take the business model to the market and let the market to tell me where I'm not doing as well, and I learn it and adapt. I think as opposed to a lot of multinational companies, they tend to be more conservative. They want to be more precise. They want to really study, study, and study, and study, and study, and study before they do anything. That's good in many ways, but in this world of fast changes, high speed, and also, you know, the consumers are actually the real knowledge information source rather than your market research firm. Make it big. And going to the market fast is often seen as a good thing. And so by definition, compared to the big multinational companies, these Chinese disruptors usually, they're much more speedier, they're fast, they're much more agile, they can be flexible, they're much more adaptable. They learn and adapt and so on. And also in the process, they discover something that the West do not understand, do not know. And I call it triple jumping, which I'll explain later in the next slide. And for many of these companies, especially those in the internet business, for them, the industry boundaries as defined traditionally do not quite matter as much anymore. Because, you know, for a long time, you know, if you are a multinational company, you're an established company, the way that you introduce yourself would be by what industry you're in. I'm a Coca-Cola, so I'm in the soft drinks industry. I'm in General Motors. I work in the automotive industry. I'm from XMCG. I'm in machinery industry. Right? That's how you describe yourself. But this guy said, well, this disruptor said, well, you know, industry boundaries are interesting, but it wouldn't constrain me by defining what I want to do. I can go in and then get out from industry boundaries. Or in fact, another way of how they talk about it is that industry boundaries are being redefined every day. The industry boundary is mobile. You know, I can get in and out. I can create industries by myself. It's very, very interesting. And I explain to you a bit more about what it means. These companies are also very good in building what they call the platforms or ecosystems. So a lot of times they don't just do everything by themselves. Sometimes they build by themselves. A lot of times they don't. They form partnerships. They form collaborations. They form the ecosystems. You know, it's an ecosystem of a number of different firms, companies, everyone trying to do things together so the capabilities can add up together, can be added up together, and they often are complementary. So competition in the future is no longer between companies and companies. That's the old-time thinking. Increasingly, competition or collaboration is across ecosystem and ecosystems. It's a very powerful way of thinking about business, and the Chinese guys, these disruptors, are very, very good in embracing this, including Alibaba. I think Eric Jin, who came yesterday, represent Alibaba. Alibaba's Jack Ma, you know, if he go to give a speech now, I can say for sure that he will talk about ecosystem, because it is a main part of how Alibaba built the business, including that for Ant Financial, where I think Eric was a senior guy in the organization. And that's how it works. The Chinese guy, without knowing it, actually discovered a third way of thinking and executing on business strategy. I call it the third way, which is in the middle. Because I think for those of you who study business, how many of you actually from the business school or associated with business school? All right, very good. And I'm sure in business school you have strategy courses, right? And maybe professors from strategy, right? Okay, for a long time, you know, in the West, in particular in US, the mainstream thinking about strategy are at the two extremes. You know, in the 70s and the 80s, the prevailing thought in America or in Western Europe was that people are okay to form conglomerate. Conglomerate, on the right-hand side, is an assembly of businesses, and they can be random. And typical examples of big conglomerates at that time were ITT, right? Were Tyco Group. I think, you know, these are really well-known companies. And in the UK, there's a big company called Hanson Trust, which is a financial holding company. Okay. But after a little while, the capital market said, well, you know, it's good to be big, but since there's little synergy across your little different businesses, it's not a good idea. It's not the best way to create value for the shareholders. And so the capital market began to criticize on this approach. And therefore, you know, the likes of ITT and Tyco began to, you know, divest, right? I think you know the story. So almost as a response to that, on the left-hand side, in the 1990s, actually a new concept came up, which is called core competence. In fact, a landmarkish article or book was published at that time, an article on HBR, and followed by a book called The Core Competence of the Corporation. It was written by two professors from University of Michigan, the Ross School of Business School. One is Professor Gary Hamel, the other is Professor C.K. Palihap. And basically what they said, based on the research, it was actually a very simple notion. They said, well, all the successful companies, they run the business based on their strength. Vice versa, non-successful companies are those who do business of the areas of strength. That sounds commonsensible, right? Of course, right? You know, if you want to be successful, do things on your strength. They call it core competence or capabilities, as some of the consultants said. It sounds very commonsensible, and in fact, that simple notion is still the governing thought, the governing philosophy on business strategy even today in America and in the Western Europe. And so you see a lot of times you see mergers, acquisitions, divestment, company needs to be divested, chopped in half, and so on, rejuggle and so on, restructured, because capital markets said you still need to do this because, you know, in fact, out of this concept, people call this focus. You need to focus on what you're good at. And what it means is actually that you draw a circle, a boundary to your business, and companies should not get out from the boundary. Maybe you get out a little bit, but you certainly don't get out in a big way. Because if you get out a big way, the capital market will say, oh, you're being unfocused, and I'm going to penalize you by lowering your valuation. And so all the CEOs, Fortune 500 CEOs are now very inward looking. Every one of them are inward looking, including some of the headquarters here in Minneapolis. Because they say, well, I should not get out from what I've been doing the last 20, 40, 50 years. A lot of people come to me and ask Dr. Say, why do the multinationals in general not that successful in China? I said, this is the reason. Because multinationals draw themselves a confined boundary. They don't look at the opportunities. It's so paradoxical that this kind of framework that has been so prevalent for the last 30 years, 40 years, has been treated as the holy grail in management science, have neglected one big part in business. And what is that? What? The left-hand side, core competence. It have neglected a big part of business. And what is that? Yeah, certainly, yeah. But it's even more basic than that. Huh? No, it's even more basic than that. Huh? Exactly. Think about this. It's all inward looking. It means that, the philosophy was such a theory such that you only do business on your strength. So my strength. But what happened to my environment? This theory says, you should build on your strength no matter the market is growing 100%, or the market is growing at 0%, or the market is growing at negative 100%. Has no relevance to the market. Think about this. Isn't that incredible? Of course, the Chinese guys, as I mentioned, especially the early guys, fortunately, they didn't go to business school, many of them. Or they went to business school after the fact. And a lot of them didn't quite, So what happened was that, of course, the Chinese guys would start with something. They're entrepreneurial, they start something. And they would build some core competence on their own. But more often than not, in a place like China, and for the matter in the Silicon Valley as well, opportunity will show up as you're building your first business. The opportunity will go up. And when the opportunity shows up, the entrepreneurs find that there is a capability gap, as shown in the red arrow, right? And so they make the judgment whether or not they want to jump from where they are to capture the new opportunity. Even when there are new opportunity, often they show up in a discontinuous and the S-curve, right? So before it crossed the inflection point, when the curve was a little bit flat, they would decide whether they jump or not. Some of them would jump. Some of them would jump. This is what happened on the left-hand side. Some of them would jump, and they would latch on to this next opportunity. Some of them would not jump, and they would not be able to latch on, and they drop, and some of them get killed. Some of them decided to stay and do not jump. All these three possibilities happen in China. But as China was growing so rapidly, in particular with the enablement of the internet, opportunities shows up in multiple fashion, many opportunities. And for those who jump over, the batting average is pretty high, actually. Because if you swing the bat, if there's a lot of balls who came your way, you swing a bat, you may hit some balls, right? Even if you're not a good professional batter. That's what the Chinese are very good at. They swing and they hit the ball, and I say the batting average for those who get it is very high. This approach, this multiple jumping approach, is actually how an Alibaba, a Tencent, and a company like LeTV and so on, this company has been growing. None of the multinationals get this. They still on the left-hand side. They stay there. They say, well, let's not get out. Let's stay and stay. So while you can stay, the rest of the world, in particular in China, they move behind you. They move beyond you. And you lose the opportunity. And then guys like Alibaba, they pick up the business. And that's how exponential organizations were born. Ali is one typical and frankly very successful exponential organizations. And one of their capability gaps on the right-hand side the companies who jump, they will fill the capability gaps along the way. They don't make it a precondition. They make it a condition along the way. And they can fill part of the gaps by themselves, and then they use third parties, the collaboration partners, the ecosystem to fill the rest, to close the gap as quickly as possible. Many of you by now have heard about the story about how eBay in 2003, Mac Whitman, she was the CEO at that time, wanted to come to China and take over the China market, right? I think you know the story. I don't need to repeat. eBay by definition was the biggest C2C company in the world, largest in America. Mac Whitman was the star, CEO, and so on. And I think you know the story. She proclaimed that we're going to take over China in no time. You also know that at that time, there's a little company called Alibaba who was just starting with a B2B business on the bottom, and they saw the giant coming called eBay, and Jack Ma was nobody. He had no clue what a C2C business was all about, but he created the business himself. And of course, in 2 years, he had beaten Mac Whitman hands down. That's the story. It's that entrepreneurship. It's that can-do attitude. It's that can-do, I can do. I'm not afraid, I can do. Who is the Mac Whitman? I can beat her. That's kind of philosophy. It's a very, very daring and a very entrepreneurial way of thinking about how to build a business. And this sort of disruption by this kind of Chinese companies are all happen every day. We work across many industries, but one of the industries that we work in the most is automotive. And we monitor this, and almost every day we see news about collaborations, partnership, incumbents working with new players, automakers working with internet players, and so on. A lot of new ideas, new ventures are happening every day. And many of them, as I mentioned, they build ecosystem. But when they build ecosystem, they don't build on a random basis. All of them still have the core. The ecosystem, the partnership, still can be traced back to the core of what they do. So for Alibaba, is e-commerce. So on the left-hand side, that's sort of an ecosystem of Alibaba into a lot of different things, but it will never get out from the core of e-commerce. On the right-hand side is Xiaomi. Their core, their origin is Internet of Things. So while they build a lot of different partnerships, they never forget their core is back in the Internet of Things. And that explains the difference between these sort of companies and the random conglomerates that we talk about, like the ITTs, like the Hang Seng Trust, where they didn't even have a core. And in the process, they're also disrupting the value chain. In the old days, like the auto industry, the value chain is usually linear, and it's step by step all the way until the customer. But in the new era, when these internet companies, they're disrupting not only the companies, but also how the value chain is becoming much more multidimensional. It's not a linear value chain anymore. It's almost like a three-dimensional net, a three-dimensional cube of where and how value can be delivered to the end customers. And there are companies like Le TV, Le Eco in China, and what they do is they're actually dabbling in not only in one sector. They started as a content provider, like a Netflix in China, and then they get into smart TV manufacturing. From smart TV, they get into smart devices, and now getting into smart vehicles. Because what Le Eco or Le TV is saying that, the consumers, my customers, I want to stay sticky with them. So when they're at home, they can watch my smart TV. When they're on the move, they can use my smart devices. And when they're in a car, especially in driverless cars, where we don't need to really pay attention to driving, they can watch my content. They can watch TVs. They can listen to everything. I want to be an end-to-end provider to them. And in fact, what they're now saying is that we're going to make our hardware free. They haven't said for the cars yet, but certainly for the TV and perhaps the smart devices, they're going to offer the hardware, the product for free, because they're thinking about generating the value from the content and the services. And that's how ambitious they are. They are building a new electrical vehicle plant in Nevada. Right outside, it's $1 billion investment. They have acquired a company called Faraday Future, an American incorporated company, and they are taking on at least they claim they're trying to take on Elon Musk. Let's see how it goes. But this is the ambition and the business model of some of these new players. And these new guys, they're not only in the internet. Of course, many of them are in the internet, but they're also in other fields as well. They're in technology, they're in consumer, retail, in healthcare, in automotive, financial services, and so on. And you know, one of the guys on the upper right-hand corner, the second one, is a guy called Wang Tao. He's in his 30s, mid-30s. He's running a company called DJI. Some of you may know, some of you may not know them. It's based in Shenzhen. DJI is the world's leading consumer drones company. Drones about this size, humanoid flying machine, right? It is the world's most sophisticated flying machines. It has the latest, I think the latest model is called Phantom 3. I believe they have 4, maybe 6 cameras. And they have sensors that can bypass stationary objects as they fly. DJI have the world's largest market share in the product area. I believe, according to Forbes, I believe they have 70% of the market share. All the R&D is done in Shenzhen. There's no copying, as far as I know. If there's any copying, it is American companies trying to copy them. That's how the world is changing. And so China, in my view, is becoming the world's breeding ground for business innovation. Not necessarily technology innovation, it's going to come, but business models certainly. And there's a number of reasons. One is what I mentioned. The transition from a planned economy to the market economy has been taking several decades. It's still going on. Every time when there's a change, it creates this continuous opportunity and threats. The society that we're in China, we inherited from the planned economy and also from a very ancient country. By definition, as compared to the modern requirements, there's a lot of imperfection, a lot of pain points. But the pain points are actually opportunities for the entrepreneurs. When people see this imperfection, the dissatisfaction of the Chinese citizens, and there's an enabler called the wireless internet, together with the inspiration and the ideas generation from the people. When you put the two together, there's a lot of new ideas that are coming up to address the pain points. China, of course, has a large market that allows companies to be not perfect and use the market to learn, adapt, and to scale up in an exponential manner. There's very few other places in the world where you have such a market size to allow experimentation, and China offers that. And of course, the prevalence of technology, in particular is wireless technology, wireless internet, is really enabling the entrepreneurs to more tools to generate new business ideas. And also, there's a lot of money around. There's a lot of money from angels and VCs. A lot of them come from America, from the Silicon Valley. Increasingly, a lot of local money. A lot of these guys have made a lot of money in the last 20 years. And it's still not over. I say the game is still going on in a significant way. The next wave is going to be in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and all the this sort of stuff that is becoming more and more prevalent, and the application of this latest technology into business in terms of both B2B and B2C. And the Chinese guys are beginning to go outside of China as well. Many are now coming to the US, but also a lot to Europe, a lot to Australia and so on. And you will begin to see more and more the presence of the Chinese disruptors, and also other type of Chinese companies, including SOEs along the way. So this is my book. This book was published in July of last year in the UK and the US. And I think it is called on a pretty good theme that people are very interested in, which is on entrepreneurship and innovation. And it has won quite a number of awards, where I'll talk later. So for me, I don't have an answer or answers for many of my clients who will come to talk to me about this issue. I would merely just raise some questions, because every case is different. And I'm raising this on behalf of my multinational clients. And I asked them, look, who are these guys to you? You don't know them actually 5 years ago. You may have heard about Alibaba. You never thought of them, who they are and the implication for you. But you must now. Who are they? Are they your competitors? Are they your collaborators? Are they changing the rules of your business in your business, or are they going to help you? Are these guys only relevant to you within China? Or are they China for the world? Are they beginning to affect you outside of China? Increasingly, my clients are saying the latter, actually. And then for you, as a multinational company, what's China for you anyways? Is China always at the fringe of your global business? No matter how you say about it, you say China is interesting, important, and so on. Mentally, it's still at your fringe, right? At the edge of what you do. But I can tell you that, I started talking about this over 10 years ago. I said, the multinational who get it about China, who are successful in China, and capture the maximum potential that China offers to them, by the way, they're a minority, if any, they all put China right at the core of the global strategy and global organization. Mentally, if you don't do that, you don't have a chance. If you do that, you have a fighting chance. And what is that? And that is very simple. That is the mindset of the CEO and the board. Is that how you think about it? If you think about this way, you have result this way. If you think about this way, you have result the other way. And finally, I offer to the challenge for a multinational, how can you be more Chinese than the Chinese? Because you're competing with the Chinese in many ways. I'm not asking you to become ethnic Chinese. It's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking for the mindset. Because as I mentioned, a lot of these guys are fast, they're agile, they're flexible, they learn and adapt. Multinationals are more precise, more stationary. They do a lot of checking and balancing. They call it compliance, which is important, but sometimes they overdo it when they come to a place like China. So how do you adjust is, again, not a trivial question. So I'm going to end my presentation by showing you just a few more slides, and these are non-content slides, but I'm very delighted and frankly very honored that my book has received pretty good mention and reviews from some of the leading media, like Forbes, like Financial Times, like Time, like The Economist, actually a few times by The Economist, by Forbes and Fortune. And also, I won a few awards, global awards or international awards, and also at the bottom, also my Chinese edition, who came out in December, also get on the Xinlang, the best book in November last year, top best book last year. So, and then I made a book tour last year to London. Also in New York, I was in CNBC. I was quite interesting. It was the first time that I was on the trading floor. I've never done that, and it was live on the trading floor. Even it was like 4 or 5 minutes. It felt long, but it was an incredible experience. So that's it. That's who we are. Thank you very much for your attention.
We agreed beforehand that we would call each other Ed, but I'm sure you can tell us apart. It shouldn't be any problem. And we already have a lot of good questions. So in the US, we hear all the time that the Chinese education system does not develop an entrepreneurial spirit. Is this changing, or where are these entrepreneurs coming from?
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, thank you very much. I think for a long time, people were criticizing on China's capability to be innovative and creative. And there are a number of pretty common reasons where people have used to try to explain that, right? So education is one. Education system is one. And by the way, I'm a product of that education system myself. But also, commonly used or asked questions or reasons are things like the lack of IPR protection, right? Corruption, unfair competition, more biased towards the Chinese companies, less so than the multinational, etc. So, and even some people say, well, how come the Chinese never have a Nobel laureate until recently, right? Until last year, there's no Chinese Nobel laureate in science, right? Technology, and that's all true. Everything is true. In fact, the education system has a lot of problems, right? But at the same time, if you look at the whole picture, every of those observations that I mentioned is correct in the wrong way. But if you look at the entire picture, they're incorrect. None of these individual reasons have prevented the rapid rise of the Chinese entrepreneurship and the Chinese innovation. None of them. As I mentioned, there are waves of young people who are coming, after the likes of Jack Ma and so on. So where do we get a Jack Ma, right? Jack Ma is a product of the education. Nobody taught. In fact, he didn't, as I mentioned, didn't study university. He took 3 times university examination, and 3 times he failed. That means he may not be a good product of the education system. But nonetheless, I think all this analysis about, education system, IPR is bad. I think this is overly analyzed, and they don't really understand the trend that we talk about, which is the fact, as I mentioned, is that the country is opening up. The country is giving the opportunities to young people. The government actually is not clamping down on these people. They are allowing them to be entrepreneurial. And human beings, no matter it's, Caucasians, the Orientals, or black people, it doesn't matter. Everyone have the tendency to want to improve, to want to be successful. As long as the environment is providing them with the opportunity, the people will grab on the opportunity. So I say that, the reason is simply that China has now get into the stage where, from the government standpoint, from our society standpoint, from the human beings, individual standpoint, this is now the time to be successful this way. And a lot of people are trying. Many of them will not be successful, but a few of them would. But a few of them will become role model for the next way to come. Education is bad, but it's not a deterrent to that entrepreneurship.
Well, then maybe along those lines, from what you just also said, mentioning the government, how is the government really helping or negatively impacting these entrepreneurs?
Well, first of all, again, it depends, and one needs to be pretty careful. There are quite a few cases for all along where the Chinese entrepreneurs has been mistreated by government, by the local government, by various local governments. The reason can be quite varied. Some of the reasons are quite legitimate, that some of the entrepreneurs may be stepping over the line. Some of them actually not legitimate, where perhaps some of the local government people are just quite, they're not lawful themselves either. But those are the sporadic cases over the years. But on this main theme of the entrepreneurship that I'm talking about, in particular driven by the major companies like the internet companies, the Chinese government so far has been extremely supportive. And as you know, Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping for that matter, but Li Keqiang in particular, he had made it very clear every time he comes out to talk about this sort of things on a formal basis, is that entrepreneurship and innovation is become the top agenda of China's national strategy. And so everyone knows that innovation and entrepreneurship can only be initiated by the private companies. SOEs can ride on the bandwagon. It's very, very difficult and almost unrealistic to anticipate, to ask the SOEs to drive that. They can be part of it. The drivers and the engines are all the private entrepreneurs, including many of the young people that I talk about. So from the government standpoint, they require these private companies, these private entrepreneurs to be successful, and therefore, by definition, the government is extremely supportive. But of course, there's one big issue too. The issue is that, by definition, innovation, including those here in America and other places, a lot of times because they are so advanced, they can get into areas which is not entirely regulated. No countries in the world, including America, can have every regulation and policy written in great details before the innovation came out. And therefore, a lot of times, innovators will get into areas that is a little bit murky in terms of regulation. Applies in China, applies here too. So far in China, so far, and I can relate back to that, to the Eric Lee question. So far in China, the Chinese government has been extremely lenient to allow the entrepreneurs to operate in this unclear regulatory area and not try to shut them down. Ant Financial, for those of you who attended Eric Lee's, right? He's a senior guy at Ant Financial, right? A big part of Ant Financial, by the way, Ant Financial, for those of you who don't know, when they get listed this year, they become the world's largest valued company, the world's largest valued financial institution in the world this year. And this will be a Chinese company. And big part of what they do is a business called Yuebao. What is Yuebao? Yuebao is a wealth management company. It's actually the money available in an escrow account when people are doing transaction on Taobao, that they need the escrow. And that escrow amount actually is a lot of money because of number of transactions on Taobao. That actually becomes a wealth management business. You think about this. Alibaba had no banking license, had no securities license. And the amount of money that they have is significant. That the Chinese government did not clamp them down. You think about, could it happen in America? It never would. This is how the Chinese government is supporting entrepreneurship. And of course, you know, it goes pretty well now. I mean, then Ant Financial is going to go listed. And it's going to create a lot of multi-millionaire in the process.
Can the disruptors help with some of the issues that China's facing in terms of quality of air, quality of water, the food supply?
By definition. Well, what I was saying, you know, China has come a long way, but China also have a lot of baggage. And so in the process, you know, of China's progress, it has also created a lot of issues. And of course, a lot of businessmen, or business people, when they first do the business, they focus on what they want to make money and so on. But a lot of people, after they reach a certain stage, they begin to figure out, you know, in fact, there's something else that we need to do. So some people are, like a couple of days ago, Pony Ma, right? Pony Ma, the Tencent CEO, he decided to donate 100 million shares of Tencent for charity. 100 million. And how much? It's about $2 billion US dollars. And where's the money is going to be using for? Is for these good causes, for environment, for water, and for education, and so on. So that's one part, is the self-revelation of these entrepreneurs after they made it. But increasingly, I must mention, because the China is full of pain points. These pain points include some of the issues that you talk about: the air problem, the food safety problem, the pollution problem, etc. The traffic jam problem. Because of these pain points, entrepreneurs are coming up with new ways, new business model to address this, because that, of course, will give the upside potential. And that's what's happening. A lot of young entrepreneurs in particular are getting themselves into this kind of areas to try to make improvement.
You talked about the multiple generations of founders, and these companies that you profile are very much the creation of those founders. But some of them now are reaching the age where they might have to be thinking about succession. And what kinds of issues are they facing as they look at that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, by definition, right? You know, especially the people who started the business in the early days in the 80s and the 90s, many of them are nearing the retirement age. They need to figure out succession plans, and some are doing a better job than some others. It's the same everywhere, right? But I think one big phenomenon that's happening in China, and again, I think this is relatively not too well understood, and sometimes a little underappreciated, is China is getting into an era of sharing of wealth. Many of the Chinese entrepreneurial companies, including the ones I talk about, they are forming what they call partnerships. Not a law firm or a consulting firm partnership. Even corporations are forming partnerships. Because what they want to do is to have a group of people who are not just getting a stock options like the way that we do it in America, but also have a way that they can be together. They share the same values. They share the same mission about what they want to achieve. And this achievement, or the values or the mission, oftentimes goes beyond what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so that is also one mechanism to address the succession issue, because by definition, the partnership is multiple people. Some are older, some are middle, some are younger. And through that working together, through that sharing of the mission and sharing the values, you begin to get to know who are the next generation of the better people. Instead of me as a CEO to pick one guy based on what I like or I like and so on, it is actually a group process of multiple people who are together already, but also have a chance to share the softer side of a company, about the mission and value. Because ultimately, as you know, it's not only about the capabilities, but also your belief, about your mission, about your passion about what you do. And this way is a very significant and innovative way of naturally selecting the next person who's going to lead the company.
So we have time for just one more question, but near the end of your book, you talk about the upheavals that China has gone through over the last 100 years, and you write that this should give pause to anyone who sees the country's current stability as permanent. And you pose the question, possibly it may endure, but can anyone be certain? What's your opinion of that today?
I think I think that for those of you who are either Chinese or you study Chinese history, you know that there's a lot of ups and downs in our history, and we believe that we have 5,000 years of history, maybe 3,000 documented, but we like to call it 5,000. We look as more ancient, and in this whole process, there are periods of stability, there are periods of instability. It's just a notion. It's just that's how it goes. At the same time, but if you take a step back and look at the era that we have gone through. When I take a step back, I'm talking about hundreds of years, right? And since about 175, 180 years, the Chinese history has been a long decline. Is some of a decline since the Opium War, but not only the Opium War. Opium War, frankly, was not a big deal, but it's actually the war, a war with the Japanese, and then Japanese and Russia war, and then of course the Japanese invasion, and then it was a long-term decline, and all the way until what I talk about, the Cultural Revolution. That was really bad. If you take a long history, that's really bad for us because we used to be pretty good, and we lost it. But if you also take a look at it, you say, well, it's so bad that it can be worse, and so this is now the upturn. This upturn, actually, what we're now seeing today, what I talk about, the reason why China is being so innovative is a lot of the why not me is actually an extension of the catching up mentality. That catching up is that the end of a cultural revolution is like the unbreaking of a dam. Before it was a dam with a lot of water dam upside. When the dam was opened up or destroyed, the water flows down. It carries a lot of momentum. And we are still seeing that momentum today. In fact, that downhill momentum continue to pick up new momentum. So what we are seeing, at least I'm seeing, is that after 180 years of this downturn, we're beginning to see this. And we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We're just seeing the beginning of another long period. And that long period may be 100 years, maybe 200, maybe 1,000. Whoever that is, I don't know, maybe 50. But it ain't going to be zero. It ain't going to be a crash, as many people talk about. People who talk about this don't understand what's going on because they don't come to China. They don't live in China. They write about stories in Washington, D.C., or in New York City, or wherever. They talk about it without real. If you're in China, if you talk to the common day people, you talk to the government, you talk to the entrepreneurs, you talk to the young people, you have the feeling. And that's the feeling that I get, is that we are now just at the beginning of another uptick. And that uptick is a long-term uptick. In the meantime, there's going to be ups and downs. Of course, nobody is going to, even America was not straightforward. Nobody is straightforward. But China is on an average uptick. And I think there's still a long, long ways for China to reach another apex. But time will come. China will reach an apex, will come down again, but not in my lifetime.
Well, we're very glad to have you in Minneapolis today.
Thank you.
So on behalf of the China Center, I'd like to again thank Dr. Xie for his very informative and very fascinating discussion about the new business models in China. And on behalf of the Bob and Kim Griffin and the university, I'd like to present him with the plaque for this lecture.